The Flaxborough Flower and Craft exhibition had, for several decades, been the most exciting event that could be described by the word nice. It attracted a degree of competition, civic pride, and faint scandal entirely disproportionate to its humble purpose. On this particular Saturday afternoon, the church hall smelt of carnations, sponge cake, and moral judgment. Mrs. Winstable, who had won the sponge cake category 7 years running, was telling anyone who would listen that she might withdraw next year, as she'd rather let others have a chance. No one believed her, and everyone admired her for saying it. At the far end of the hall stood the centerpiece of this year's exhibition, a delicate silver cradle lined with pale satin, part of the historic Flaxborough display organized by the Women's Guild. It had been lent by Mrs. Edith Gallo, widow of the late Alderman Gallo, who had once presented the town with its least useful clock tower. "It's been in the family since 1882, she told a small crowd, her voice rising above the hum of conversation. "It was given to my husband's grandmother upon the birth of their first son, solid silver, hall-marked. If you look closely, you can see the initials E.G. engraved just here." Several ladies leaned forward obediently as though summoned to venerate a relic. By 4 o'clock the raffle was drawn, the cucumber sandwiches reduced to curling triangles, and the cradle, quite unmistakably, gone. The discovery came not with a scream or dramatic accusation, but with a faintly puzzled murmur from Miss Lucilla Vole, a thin woman whose spectacles made her eyes appear permanently startled. "Oh," she said softly, "that's odd." "What's odd?" asked Mrs. Winstable, whose tone implied that most things Miss Vole found odd were perfectly ordinary. "The cradle," said Miss Vole, gesturing toward the empty table draped in lace. "It seems to have moved." Moved was an optimistic term. The space was empty except for the card that read, "Kindly do not touch," loaned by Mrs. E. Gallo. For a few seconds no one quite reacted. Then, as if on cue, heads turned, lips pursed, and the air filled with the small, sharp whispers that in Flaxborough served as both alarm and entertainment. "Surely it's been taken to the vestry for cleaning." No, Mrs. Gallo was quite clear about supervision. "Perhaps one of the men helped move it for safety." Men! They'd been outside judging the marrow competition all afternoon. The vicar, the Reverend Harcourt, was fetched. He arrived with a calmness born of professional habit and mild confusion born of personality. "A cradle," he said. "Good heavens, why on earth would anyone take a cradle?" No one had an answer, but everyone had a theory. Mrs. Winstable suggested youthful mischief. Miss Vole whispered, "Symbolism." Mrs. Gallo, pale and rigid, declared that some people in this town never forgave her husband for the clock tower. By the time Inspector Pubright was informed 2 hours later, the church hall had emptied of spectators but was heavy with self-importance. The remaining ladies spoke in tones normally reserved for funeral arrangements. Pubright arrived without visible urgency. He had been at the station reviewing paperwork about a missing bicycle, the sort of case Flaxborough produced with touching regularity. When told of the cradle's disappearance, he made a sound somewhere between interest and mild amusement. "Silver, you say? Not merely plated?" "Solid," affirmed Mrs. Gallo, watching him with the wary intensity of one who has always suspected the police of quiet derision. He bent slightly over the vacant table, examining the lace cloth, then the scuffed floor beneath. "No marks," he murmured. "But then thieves rarely leave notes of thanks." His constable, Sidney Love, a well-meaning but literal young man, asked, "Do you think it's connected to that rash of burglaries in Grimsby, sir?" Pubright straightened, suppressing a smile. "If the Grimsby burglars have turned to ecclesiastical decor, Love, then yes, though I rather doubt it. He turned to the assembled ladies. Might I ask, when was the cradle last seen? Mrs. Winstable pursed her lips. 3:30. Miss Vole and I were tidying the scone table. Mrs. Gallo had just been telling Mrs. Briggs about how her family never believed in nannies. Purbright's gaze rested briefly on Mrs. Gallo, who shifted her handbag defensively. And who had access to this area? Everyone, Miss Vole said simply. That's what makes it dreadful. Purbright nodded slowly. Yes. When everyone may be guilty, the difficulty lies in finding who needed to be. He walked the hall once more, noting the small things others missed. A faint oval of dust where the cradle had stood, the faintest crease in the lace cloth, as though something had been lifted with care, not haste. And then, beside the table leg, a tiny folded paper, no larger than a matchbox, half tucked beneath the carpet edge. He unfolded it carefully. Inside, faded pencil lines formed an address. Fentiman's Babywear, Flaxborough Road, 1949, a shop, long closed. Purbright pocketed the paper without comment. He did not, as was his habit, allow curiosity to quicken his expression. Instead, he thanked the ladies for their assistance, advised them not to discuss the matter too freely, and left them immediately to do exactly that. By dusk, the town knew of the missing cradle. By nightfall, it had been upgraded, through retelling, to a daring daylight robbery by a known gang from Norwich. And by morning, as Mrs. Gallo sat stiffly at breakfast, she found herself wondering whether she had been a fool to lend it at all, or whether someone had at last remembered what the cradle once held. By Sunday morning, the disappearance of Mrs. Gallo's silver cradle had become the chief subject of moral reflection in Flaxborough, displacing for the time being both the state of the high street pavements and the vicar's unfortunate sermon on marital patience. The Women's Guild, who met that morning for their usual post-service tea, regarded the matter not as theft, but as commentary. Someone, they agreed, was making a point. Precisely what that point might be was open to interpretation. And interpret they did. "It's envy," said Mrs. Winstable firmly, stirring her tea with the same vigour she applied to sponge batter. People can't bear to see a respectable woman admired. That's why Edith Gallo was targeted. Miss Vole blinked earnestly behind her spectacles. It could be a protest against materialism. Materialism? Mrs. Winstable repeated the word as if Miss Vole had proposed free love. It's silver, Lucilla, not sin. Across the table, Mrs. Briggs, the guild treasurer, leaned forward with the conspiratorial relish of one about to contribute something truly significant. "I heard," she began, "that Mrs. Gallo's husband had the thing made to mark a birth that never took place." There was a small, scandalized gasp, followed by the sort of silence in which teacups are adjusted and consciences rearranged. "Oh, I'm sure that's nonsense," murmured Miss Vole, too quickly to sound convinced. "Well," said Mrs. Briggs, lowering her voice, "you know what they say about the gallows and that housemaid, before the clock tower, I mean." Mrs. Winstable drew herself up with the solemn air of a woman about to defend both virtue and municipal architecture. The gallows were pillars of the community. "Precisely," said Mrs. Briggs with satisfaction, "and pillars always have cracks." While reputations were being measured and cracked open in the church hall, Inspector Pubright was taking a slow walk down Flaxborough High Street. It was one of those mild autumn mornings when nothing seemed likely to happen, yet everything might. He paused before the window of what had once been Fentiman's Babywear, now a beauty salon promising contour without surgery. Behind the frosted glass he could just discern the shadow of a woman having her hair rearranged in a way nature had long ceased to approve. The address on the folded paper from the hall had led him here, though he expected no revelation. The shop had closed 20 years ago, Fentiman himself having died in the same year as Queen Mary, an event the local paper had given equal coverage. Pubright stood a moment longer, gazing at the faint lettering still visible beneath the newer paint, Fentiman and Son Infant Clothiers. Then he walked on. He had the habit of appearing to think less than he did. It was a useful disguise in a town where speculation was considered a virtue and certainty an indecency. Constable Love, meanwhile, had taken it upon himself to canvass the market square for witnesses. His method was enthusiastic rather than methodical, and by the time Pubright found him, he had gathered 4 conflicting accounts and 1 offer of a date. "Sir," he said, bright-eyed, "I've spoken to Mrs. Peebles from the haberdashery. She says she saw a man leaving the church hall about 4 o'clock carrying a parcel wrapped in white cloth." "Did she recognize him?" "She thinks it might have been Mr. Tudge from the council office, but she's not certain because, quote, the light was spiritual." Pubright nodded gravely. "That must have been inconvenient for identification." "Yes, sir. She says it gave him a halo." "Ah." Pubright walked on, letting Love's words settle like autumn leaves in his mind. He had long believed that in Flaxborough truth travelled by the same slow route as the town bus, stopping often, taking detours, but generally reaching its destination by tea time. At that very moment, Mrs. Gallo was receiving a visitor of her own, Miss Vole, who had come ostensibly to offer sympathy, but more accurately, to observe distress. The Gallo house, one of the grander on St. Margaret's Road, smelled faintly of beeswax and disapproval. Its drawing-room was arranged with the precision of a crime scene, nothing out of place, nothing spontaneous. "My dear Edith," Miss Vole began, seating herself primly, "I do hope you're bearing up." Mrs. Gallo, dressed in funereal grey, though no one had died, gave a small, frozen smile. "One does one's best, Lucilla. The town can be rather cruel." "Oh, I shouldn't say cruel," said Miss Vole, whose tone suggested she meant precisely that. "Merely curious. They feel concerned, you see. It's not every day one loses a silver cradle." Mrs. Gallo stiffened. "I've always believed envy to be the least Christian of vices." "Quite so," said Miss Vole, folding her hands, "though curiosity runs a close second." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Miss Vole, her eyes glittering with the dangerous satisfaction of having something to tell, leaned slightly forward. "I did notice, Edith, at the exhibition. You seemed rather pale when you saw the cradle displayed, almost as though it surprised you." Mrs. Gallo's teacup clicked faintly against its saucer. "I was tired, Lucilla. One cannot be expected to relive one's entire life in front of a church raffle." "Of course," said Miss Vole smoothly. "Only the engraving looked newer than I remember. The initials, they shone." There was a pause. Mrs. Gallo set down her cup. "Perhaps your memory plays tricks, my dear. Time has that effect. It polishes some things, tarnishes others." Miss Vole smiled thinly. "Indeed. Still, one wonders why anyone would wish to remove such a sentimental object, unless perhaps it was too sentimental." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that lingers after a slap. When Miss Vole finally took her leave, Mrs. Gallo remained seated, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where an old photograph, faded almost to sepia, showed a younger version of herself beside her husband, holding what appeared to be that very cradle. Her lips moved slightly as if testing the memory for cracks. Back at the station, Pubright was writing in his notebook, "Cradle theft." Perhaps not theft. Symbolic act? Something returned or concealed. Fentiman's babywear, closed 1950s. Gallo family, possible link to birth, child, or false registration, Miss Vole excessively observant. He paused, his pencil resting on the paper, and added, "In Flaxborough, secrets are seldom buried, only misfiled." Then he leaned back in his chair, the faintest of smiles crossing his face. "Love," he said mildly, "find out who owns the property that used to be Fentiman's shop, and see whether Mrs. Gallo ever ordered anything there. Around 1949, Love blinked. You think she bought something, sir?" Pubright closed his notebook. Perhaps, or perhaps she didn't, and that may be the more interesting purchase. Monday morning brought with it that faint, collective unease, which in Flaxborough passed for drama. The town had not known an unsolved mystery since the affair of the missing garden gnome, and even that had been traced to a neighbour's compost heap. A silver cradle, however, was something else entirely. Valuable, sentimental, and faintly improper. The police station telephone began ringing before 9. Mrs. Winstable reported a suspicious-looking man in a raincoat seen loitering near the post office, later identified as the postmaster. The vicar's wife rang to offer information that proved to be moral guidance, and a Mr. Peabody from the council inquired whether Pubright required a statement of civic regret. By 9:30, Pubright had escaped the administrative well-wishers and was making his early rounds, his gait unhurried, his manner faintly distracted. A mask, as usual, for careful observation. His first stop was Mrs. Peebles's haberdashery, an establishment where buttons, ribbons, and rumours were sold at roughly the same price. The bell over the door tinkled with a kind of genteel anxiety. Mrs. Peebles, a stout woman whose spectacles magnified her indignation, looked up from a display of lace trims. "Oh, Inspector, I hoped you'd call," she said, lowering her voice to the confidential register of those who believe themselves indispensable to justice. "I saw the man, you know." "Yes," said Pubright pleasantly. "Constable Love mentioned your description. A man carrying a parcel." She nodded emphatically. "White cloth, about so big." She demonstrated with a sweep of her hands that suggested either a cradle or a modest turkey. "He went past my shop window at precisely 5 minutes past 4. Did you recognize him?" "Well, I thought it was Mr. Tudge, but when I told Mrs. Winstable, she said he was at the council offices all afternoon, and Mrs. Winstable's cousin works with his sister, so she'd know." Pubright inclined his head gravely. "Then we mustn't be hasty in condemning Mr. Tudge." Mrs. Peebles beamed at the compliment to her restraint. "Still," she said, "he walks like a guilty man." "I'll keep an eye on his stride," said Pubright. "Thank you, Mrs. Peebles. You've been very observant." He left before she could add that she had also once seen the vicar buy sherry. The Reverend Harcourt lived in a state of mild theological disorder. His study resembled an explosion in a hymn book factory, and his face expressed a perpetual struggle between benevolence and bewilderment. "Inspector," he said warmly, shaking Purbright's hand, "I do hope all this unpleasantness won't interfere with the harvest festival. Mrs. Gallo is most anxious that her loss be viewed in a Christian spirit." "I'm sure she is," said Pubright. "It's a curious affair, though. You were present most of Saturday afternoon?" The vicar frowned, trying to remember. "On and off. There was the judging of the marrow competition, and then Mrs. Winstable required assistance with a power socket." "Why?" "Did you notice anyone paying unusual attention to the cradle display?" The vicar smiled faintly. "My dear Inspector, every woman in that hall paid unusual attention to it. It represented the nearest thing to aristocracy most of them will ever see." Purbright's mouth twitched. "Quite so. And yet," continued the vicar, leaning back thoughtfully, "I did observe that Mrs. Gallo seemed nervous, as though she regretted displaying it. When Miss Vole suggested adding a placard with its history, Mrs. Gallo nearly refused. Odd that. She's normally proud of anything that bears her name. Pubright noted this mentally. Was there any mention of her family? Children, perhaps? The vicar hesitated, then coughed. Well, there was talk years ago of a stillbirth. Tragic business. They never had another. I shouldn't like to repeat idle gossip. Of course not, said Pubright, with a courtesy that both excused and recorded the confession. Mr. Tudge, the supposed cradle carrier, was found behind a desk in the Borough Treasurer's department, immersed in papers of such deadly dullness they might have been devised as an alibi. He was a narrow man in every sense, frame, mind, and morality, and spoke as though punctuation were a personal affront. Yes, Inspector, I did attend the exhibition. I was responsible for the petty cash tin. I left at 4:45. The hall was still full of women at that time, so if anything went missing later, I can hardly be blamed. Pubright smiled mildly. No one is blaming you, Mr. Tudge. Mrs. Peebles merely thought she saw you carrying a white parcel. Preposterous! The only parcel I carried was the petty cash tin, wrapped in a towel to prevent jingling. Pubright raised an eyebrow. Wrapped in a towel? It was raining, and I do not like to attract attention to public funds. I see, said Pubright, with a tone that suggested he saw much more than he said. He thanked Mr. Tudge and left, leaving behind a man now convinced of his own martyrdom to probity. Returning to the scene, Pubright stood alone amid the lingering scent of chrysanthemums and polish. The display tables were empty, their white cloths folded neatly at one end, awaiting next year's ambitions. He walked the floor again, this time with less expectation of discovery and more of reflection. The lace cloth that had once supported the cradle bore a faint, darker outline, as though something slightly damp had rested there. He knelt, touched the wood beneath, and found the faintest trace of oil. Not machine oil, something gentler, almost perfumed. Baby oil, perhaps. He straightened slowly, his face impassive, and gazed toward the far corner where a stack of folded chairs stood. One of them, he noted, had a small smear of the same substance along its leg. When he returned to the station, Constable Love was waiting with the fruits of his research. Sir, the property that used to be Fentiman's Babyware is owned by a Mrs. Edith Gallo, purchased in 1950 just after the shop closed. Pubright regarded him quietly. Indeed? And does she let it out? Yes, sir. To the salon that's there now. Key contours. Pubright leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. A babyware shop turned beauty salon. How very Flaxborough. Vanity replacing innocence. Love looked puzzled. Sorry, sir? Nothing, love. Just thinking aloud. He took out the folded scrap of paper again, the one marked Fentiman's Babyware, 1949. He flattened it carefully on the desk and studied the faded pencil lines. Someone, he thought, had kept this note for a long time, kept it until they needed to use it. Love, he said after a moment, we'll pay another visit to Mrs. Gallo tomorrow, but today go and have a word with the owner of that salon. Ask if she's ever found anything curious in the back rooms. Old ledgers, perhaps, or something stored away. Love nodded eagerly. And if she has, sir? Pubright smiled faintly. Then we shall know whether the cradle was stolen from the present or the past. That evening, as the lamps came on in Flaxborough's narrow streets and the gossip settled like dust over respectability, Inspector Pubright sat by his office window and watched the mist creep up from the river. He thought, not for the first time, how little difference there was between concealment and preservation, and how, in Flaxborough, people often mistook one for the other. By Tuesday afternoon, Flaxborough had quietly elected its first culprit. The collective mind of the town, that invisible jury composed of shopkeepers, guild members, and pensioners with time to speculate, had settled upon Miss Lucilla Vole. It wasn't that anyone truly believed her guilty of theft, it was that she seemed, in temperament and appearance, the sort of person to whom such a thing might, decorously, happen. "She's got that look," Mrs. Winstable confided to Mrs. Peebles in the bakery queue. "What look?" "The look of someone who'd do wrong for a moral reason." Miss Vole, for her part, did little to defend herself from this quietly affectionate condemnation. Indeed, her manner in recent days had become rather dramatic. She spoke of principles and truths that must sometimes be told, which in Flaxborough were practically confessions. When word reached the police station that she had been seen burning papers in her back garden, Constable Love hurried to inform his superior. "She was tearing them up first, sir," Love said eagerly. "Old letters by the look of it." Pubright regarded him with an expression of tolerant amusement. "And you think that suggests guilt?" Love hesitated. "Well, it might, sir. People do destroy evidence." "Indeed they do," Pubright said mildly. "But in Flaxborough, Love, people also burn letters from the gas board, circulars from undertakers, and correspondence reminding them of things best forgotten. We mustn't leap to melodrama. We'd only sprain something." Still, by late afternoon, Pubright had decided that a brief, polite visit to Miss Vole might be instructive, if not for the investigation, then for the anthropology of gossip. Lucilla Vole lived in one of a row of small Victorian cottages facing the allotments. Her garden was an orderly riot of hollyhocks, lavender, and moral certainty. She greeted Pubright with an expression halfway between surprise and vindication. "Inspector, I wondered when you'd come. Do step in. I dare say you've heard what they're saying." "I've heard several things," Pubright replied diplomatically, removing his hat. "It's difficult to choose among them." She led him to a parlour that smelled faintly of lavender polish and self-discipline. On a small table lay a Bible, a bowl of potpourri, and a cat of formidable size named Mr. Rochester. "I trust you don't believe I stole the cradle," she said before he could begin. "I try to believe as little as possible until forced," said Pubright pleasantly. Miss Vole smiled thinly. "A sensible policy. You see, Inspector, I know what they're whispering, that I had some quarrel with Mrs. Gallo, that I said something unkind about her family. I may have remarked that pride often invites judgment, but that's hardly treason." Pubright inclined his head. "Quite. And your fire yesterday afternoon?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Ah, that. I was destroying old letters, miss, my late sister's. She was a missionary in Rhodesia and had the unfortunate habit of describing native customs in terms that would now be considered unhelpful. I thought it best to spare posterity." "Considerate," said Pubright. "Was there anything among those papers referring to Mrs. Gallo, by any chance?" Miss Vole hesitated, then looked at him keenly. "You know something, don't you?" "I know several things, Miss Vole," he said softly, "though none are yet connected by facts, only by tone." Her face softened, curiosity overcoming self-righteousness. "Tone?" "Yes, the tone of guilt. It's rather like the smell of varnish. It clings to a surface long after the object appears dry." For a moment, her composure wavered. "If you mean Mrs. Gallo," she said at last, "then you should know she isn't the saint she pretends. She was expecting a child once. Everyone knew it. Then nothing was ever said again. No mourning, no announcement, just silence. And a new servant girl who vanished soon after." Pubright watched her face as she spoke, noting the mixture of indignation and pity. "You believe the cradle reminds her of that time?" "I believe," Miss Vole said carefully, that some reminders are too heavy to polish. He nodded, rose, and thanked her for her candour. As he reached the door, she called after him, "Inspector, if Mrs. Gallo has done something dreadful, I hope you'll be kind. She's suffered more than she lets on." Pubright turned. "My dear Miss Vole," he said gravely, "kindness and justice are often mistaken for rivals. I've found they work best as accomplices." Meanwhile, Constable Love had followed his instructions and visited Contours, the beauty salon now occupying the former Fentimans' babywear premises. He returned that evening, smelling faintly of hairspray and confusion. "She said there's an old cupboard at the back, sir," he reported. "They keep cleaning products in it now, but it used to have ledgers from the baby shop days. She showed me one, mostly bills from 1949 and 50, but there was one page torn out." Pubright raised an eyebrow. "Only one?" "Yes, sir. The owner said it was missing when she moved in. Looked like someone had cut it neatly away." Pubright leaned back, fingertips together. A single missing page in a book of bills. Fascinating. People rarely steal what they don't value. And value, in Flaxborough, often has less to do with money than memory. Love frowned. "You think Mrs. Gallo took it, sir?" Purbright's tone was mild. "Possibly. Or perhaps someone who thought they were protecting her." He closed his notebook. "Let's leave Miss Vole alone for now. She's serving her purpose perfectly well, as a distraction." That night, as the rain began to patter against the windows of his modest flat, Pubright sat reading the local paper's coverage of the affair. "Silver Cradle Mystery continues," the headline declared, followed by several paragraphs of moral embroidery courtesy of Mrs. Winstable, who had apparently appointed herself unofficial spokesperson for civic virtue. Pubright smiled faintly. Beneath the article was a single sentence that caught his attention. Mrs. Edith Gallo declined to comment, stating only that certain things are best left in God's keeping. He folded the paper slowly, his mind turning over the words like stones in a river. "Certain things," he murmured. "Not all, just certain ones." Then, reaching for his notebook, he wrote a single line. "Next visit, Mrs. Gallo," and a question about 1949. He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and sat a moment longer in the dark, listening to the rain. Steady, persistent, cleansing. In Flaxborough, he thought, sins didn't wash away. They merely soaked in. By Wednesday, the Cradle affair had ripened into that most robust of Flaxborough crops, confident misunderstanding. Every shop bell seemed to ring in time with the latest version of the story. Some said the Cradle had been stolen by an antique dealer from Lincoln. Others claimed it was the work of vagrants with refined taste. At the police station, however, Inspector Pubright was more interested in paper than speculation. "Love," he said that morning as the constable arrived balancing 2 cups of tea, "do you happen to recall that scrap of folded paper found beneath the church hall carpet? The one bearing the address of Fentimans' Babywear." "Yes, sir." "I've been looking at it again. The handwriting, fine, faint, but confident. Female, I'd say, and the pencil line at the bottom wasn't merely an address. There was the faint curve of a figure, possibly a price." Love squinted. "Price of what, sir?" "That," said Pubright, "is the question. But my suspicion is that it wasn't an order note. More likely a receipt. Something purchased and delivered to that address. Something rather small." He placed the paper flat on the desk beneath the lamplight. "See the crease marks? It was folded into thirds, as receipts often are when kept in a purse, which means someone, recently or not, had been carrying it, and then, quite carefully, dropped it in a place where it might later be found." Love frowned. "You think it was a message?" Pubright smiled faintly. "No, a reminder, but not necessarily for us." That afternoon, Pubright made his second visit to St. Margaret's Road. The Gallo residence was immaculate to the point of discomfort. It was the sort of house that looked permanently prepared for the arrival of important guests who never came. Mrs. Gallo received him with strained civility. She was dressed as ever in mourning grey, her jewellery discreet, her smile rehearsed. "Inspector," she said coolly, "I do hope this tiresome business will soon be concluded. I can assure you I have no knowledge of where the cradle might have gone." Pubright bowed slightly. "I don't doubt that, madam. My questions today are of a rather different nature. May I?" He indicated a seat. She gestured toward one with chilly politeness. "I understand you purchased the property that used to be Fentiman's Babyware," he began. Her eyes flickered, a momentary lapse quickly hidden behind composure. "Yes, my late husband considered it a sound investment." "Indeed. And was there any personal connection to the shop before that?" "None whatever." Pubright regarded her quietly. "I see. Forgive my curiosity, but the shop's records show that in the spring of 1949 an order was placed under the name Mrs. E. Gallo, an ivory christening set, silver trim. The receipt would have been marked for collection rather than delivery." For a moment she said nothing. The clock ticked loudly, then she smiled. Thinly, painfully. "You have been busy, Inspector. I doubt there are many records from that time still legible." "Just one," Pubright said softly, "or rather the ghost of one, a single torn-out page from the ledger." Her hand, resting on the arm of the chair, tightened imperceptibly. "I suppose you think I removed it?" "I think someone did," Pubright replied. "And not recently. The edges were old, brittle. Whoever tore that page out wanted a memory erased long before the cradle vanished." Mrs. Gallo rose abruptly and went to the window. "You're wasting your time, Inspector. My husband and I had no children. The cradle was merely an heirloom, a family piece. It means nothing." "On the contrary," said Pubright, "I believe it means a great deal. So much, in fact, that someone risked scandal to remove it from public view." She turned sharply. "You think I stole my own cradle?" "I think," said Pubright gently, "that perhaps you asked someone to." She stared at him for a long time. Then, without another word, she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth and left the room. Pubright waited, studying the silent furnishings. The symmetrical arrangement of photographs, none of which showed children. On the mantel, he noticed again the sepia portrait of the younger couple and the faint outline beside it, as if another frame had once stood there, removed recently. When Mrs. Gallo returned, her face was pale but composed. "I'm tired, Inspector. If you've finished, I would appreciate some peace." "Of course," he said, rising. "Peace is a luxury we all crave, though seldom afford." His next visit was shorter, but no less revealing. Mrs. Harcourt, the vicar's wife, was a woman whose expressions ranged from benevolent pity to sanctified meddling. She greeted Pubright at the vicarage door as though she'd been expecting divine company. "Oh, Inspector, come in, do. It's almost distressing, isn't it? Such talk among the women, and poor Mrs. Gallo, so misunderstood." Pubright inclined his head. "Quite. It must be difficult, being so admired." Mrs. Harcourt tittered modestly. "I try to set a good example myself, of course." He accepted tea, pale and moral in flavour, and asked mildly, "You've known Mrs. Gallo many years, I think?" "Since her marriage, yes. A tragic union, really. Mr. Gallo was a pillar of rectitude, but not, I fear, of warmth." "Did you ever hear mention of a child?" Mrs. Harcourt's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "A child?" Purbright's expression was one of mild inquiry, nothing more. "There was talk once," she admitted slowly. "Before my husband's time in the parish, a confinement that ended quietly. But one never listens to such things. The gallows were above reproach. "Above it?" said Pubright. "Or surrounded by it?" She gave a nervous laugh. "You are very droll, Inspector." He smiled politely. "I assure you, madam, I'm rarely accused of that." That evening, Pubright sat at his desk as rain tapped against the window panes. The desk lamp illuminated two objects before him, the folded scrap of paper from the church hall and a copy of the baptism register from St. Saviour's Church, a volume he'd borrowed with the vicar's blessing. The entries from 1949 were neat, methodical, and quite unremarkable, except for one small gap. Between March and April, no christening recorded. A page turned and the writing resumed, as though nothing had been missed. A missing page in the shop ledger, a missing entry in the baptism book, both from the same spring. Pubright made a note. If the cradle symbolized remembrance, perhaps its removal symbolized concealment. What if it wasn't stolen to sell, but stolen to silence? He closed the ledger, leaned back, and regarded the ceiling as if it might answer. Love knocked and entered. "Sir, one other thing. The salon owner says she sometimes hears noises in the storage room at night. Old pipes, she thinks." Pubright smiled faintly. "Pipes rarely rustle paper, love." Love blinked. "Paper, sir?" "Just a thought." He rose, put on his coat, and extinguished the lamp. "Let's have a look at that storage room tomorrow," he said. "I've an idea there may be one more piece of history waiting to confess itself." That night, as the mist rolled once more along Flaxborough Road, the town slept under the comforting illusion of moral clarity. Only Pubright, walking home beneath his umbrella, understood how flimsy that comfort could be. He thought again of the silver cradle shining under the church lights. A symbol, yes, but also a question. Who had once needed to hide the evidence of innocence itself? It rained all Wednesday night and half of Thursday, and by morning the town looked freshly varnished, respectable once more, as though repentance could be achieved by dampness alone. In the drizzle, Inspector Pubright took his time, walking from the station toward the residential streets behind St. Saviour's Church. The pavements there were lined with houses that prided themselves on clean lace curtains and silence after 10. It was among such curtains, Pubright reflected, that the more interesting crimes of Flaxborough took place, not of blood, but of omission. Contours was empty when he arrived, save for the faint, sugary smell of nail varnish and the gentle whine of a hairdryer left idling. The proprietor, Mrs. Lorna Meeks, appeared from a back corridor, wiping her hands. "Oh, Inspector Pubright, isn't it?" "You'll be after your curls," she said brightly, then blushed. "I mean, you'll be wanting to ask about the baby shop thing." "Both prospects sound alarming, Mrs. Meeks," said Pubright, removing his hat. "Yes, the shop's former life interests me more than its current one." She led him into the storeroom, a narrow, windowless space that smelled of disinfectant and forgotten decades. Metal shelves held bottles of lotion and stacks of towels. Beyond them, a cupboard of dark oak stood like a confession booth. "I keep the cleaning things in here," she said, "but you can still see the old paint under the shelves. Fentiman and Son. They must have had a counter here." Pubright ran a finger along the wall, then opened the cupboard. Inside, beneath the mops and bleach, lay a small, dust-covered box. He lifted it out carefully. Mrs. Meeks gasped. "Oh, so I've never seen that. It must have been wedged behind the baseboard." The box was of faded cardboard, tied with ribbon so brittle it crumbled at his touch. Inside lay a folded piece of ivory satin, yellowed by age, and nestled in its centre a tiny silver rattle. The handle was engraved with two initials, E.G. Pubright closed the lid gently. "Mrs. Meeks," he said, I think you've just discovered the other half of a story. From the salon, Pubright walked 3 doors down to call on Mrs. Harold, the post office widow who saw everything from her front window and forgot nothing that might become useful later. She invited him in with the warmth of one who has long considered herself an honorary policewoman. "I was just making tea, Inspector. Strong, the way a town like this needs it." "Very civil of you, Mrs. Harold. Tell me, do you recall who occupied the rooms above Fentiman's before it became a salon?" "Oh, yes. A nurse, or maybe a midwife of sorts. Name of Keach. Came from Boston way. Left suddenly years back. There was talk she'd been paid to go." "Paid by whom?" Mrs. Harold smiled with regretful discretion. Now that I couldn't possibly say, except that it wasn't the church, and it wasn't the council. Which narrows it down, doesn't it?" Pubright thanked her and left, his thoughts moving faster than his gait. A nurse, a vanished record, and a cradle no one dared display. The geometry of silence was beginning to form. That evening, Pubright returned to St. Saviour's Vicarage, ostensibly to return the baptism register. The Reverend Harcourt received him in the study, where the fire burned low and unconvincing. "I must apologize, Inspector," the clergyman said, "for the missing page. I'm afraid it vanished before my time." "I rather thought so," said Pubright. "Do you happen to know who served as parish clerk in 1949? "Old Henry Dawes," said the vicar. "Retired years ago, lives out by the railway cottages." "Ah, then he may still recall whose child was christened, or wasn't." The vicar blinked. "Wasn't?" Pubright's expression was mild. "The ledger shows a blank fortnight that year. I suspect there was a baptism that never reached paper, perhaps out of pity or out of caution." The Reverend shifted uneasily. "If such a thing occurred, I cannot imagine why." "Oh, I can," said Pubright quietly. "Flaxborough dislikes irregularities. It prefers its sins properly registered." He rose. "Thank you, Reverend. You've been most unhelpful, which is precisely what I hoped." The next morning dawned pale and crisp. As Pubright crossed the square, he noted how many windows contained watching eyes behind curtains. Eyes that vanished the instant they were met. Flaxborough, he reflected, was not a town of witnesses, only of spectators. At the station, Constable Love had gathered the latest harvest of gossip. Mrs. Winstable claimed to have seen Mrs. Gallo walking near the church at dawn 2 days before the theft. Miss Vole was reported to have fainted in the greengrocer's after overhearing mention of baby things, and a local handyman had found an old key beneath the church hall window, brass, ornate, recently polished. Pubright examined it. The initials E.G. were faintly visible on the stem. "Everything in this case," he murmured, "is monogrammed, even the truth." That afternoon, Pubright made one last call to Henry Dawes, the retired parish clerk. The old man lived among the smell of coal and boiled cabbage, surrounded by the careful clutter of unthrown decades. "Ah, Inspector," Dawes wheezed. "Not many ask about the old baptisms these days. I remember some, though. I kept my own copy for a while, till the wife told me to burn it." "Did you?" "Mostly," said Dawes with the faintest grin. "But I kept a note or two, dates, names, nothing official, mind." From a drawer he drew a tattered envelope and passed it across. Inside were several slips of paper, one marked April 3rd, 1949, infant female, mother unknown, sponsors withdrawn. Pubright looked up. "And where was the ceremony?" "Back vestry, sir. Quiet job. Mrs. Harcourt helped. Baby taken away next morning. Nobody spoke of it again." "And the name?" Dawes hesitated. "It was written, then scratched out, but I remember the sound of it." "Edie." Pubright folded the paper carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Dawes. You've just baptized a mystery." As he walked back, Through the darkening lanes, Pubright let the pieces fall together in silence. A cradle, proudly displayed, then removed. A page torn from the baptismal register. A nurse who vanished with payment. A woman who lived thereafter as if mourning something the town had never permitted her to name. By the time he reached his office, the lamps were lit, and the familiar smell of boiled tea leaves filled the air. Love looked up. "Anything useful, sir?" Pubright smiled faintly. "Everything, love. Though usefulness, like virtue, depends on where one stands." He placed the old note from Henry Dawes in his desk drawer beside the silver rattle and locked them both away. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll see whether memory can be coaxed out from behind lace curtains." That night, the town slept easily, content that its scandal had at least good manners. Only Inspector Pubright remained awake, reading by lamplight, his expression mild and unreadable. He had no need to rush. In Flaxborough, the truth never ran away. It merely waited for the right visitor to knock, politely. Thursday morning brought not calm but consternation. The vicar himself telephoned the station at 8:30, a rare event, as the Reverend Harcourt preferred to communicate all distress in person, preferably over tea. His voice was pale and fluttering through the receiver. "Inspector Pubright, I scarcely know how to say it. The baptismal register, the one you borrowed, and it's gone." Pubright, who was buttering toast with deliberate economy, said quietly, "Gone? It was in your keeping, not mine." I know," said the vicar miserably. "I returned it to the vestry cabinet last night. This morning it was unlocked. The book's missing, along with the key." Pubright paused. "How unfortunate. I don't suppose you recall who else has a key to that cabinet?" The vicar hesitated. "Mrs. Harcourt, of course, and Mrs. Gallo. She donated the cabinet some years ago." "Did she indeed?" said Pubright. He set down his cup. "Thank you, Reverend. Please refrain from sharing the news until I've called in." The vicar agreed with the heartfelt eagerness of a man already rehearsing how he would fail to do so. Half an hour later, Pubright stood in the vestry, a small, chilly room whose furnishings spoke of faith, dust, and compromise. The lock on the cabinet door showed no sign of force. Whoever had taken the register had done so tidily. On the window-sill lay a trace of something white, lint, perhaps, or the corner of a torn glove. He touched it lightly. A scent of lavender clung to it. "Love," he said, "run this over to the station. See if you can trace the scent to any of the local drapers or perfumers. Lavender. The old-fashioned sort?" "Yes, sir," said Love, whose appreciation of lavender was purely botanical. When his constable had gone, Pubright looked again at the empty cabinet. The absence of the book, he thought, was not concealment this time. It was panic. Someone had realized how close he was to reading what they'd rather remain erased. He closed the cabinet gently, as if to respect the fear that had driven its emptying. By noon, the disappearance was known from the fishmongers to the co-op. The vicar's attempt at discretion had been thwarted by his wife, whose sense of duty was indistinguishable from her love of narrative. Miss Vole was first to act on the information. She appeared at Mrs. Winstable's doorstep in the full posture of righteous indignation. "I told you," she declared. "The cradle was only the beginning. This town is being tested. Records disappearing, heirlooms vanishing. It's like the hand of judgment." Mrs. Winstable, who disapproved of judgment unless presided over by herself, sniffed. "Nonsense. It's a burglary, that's all. Probably that poor widow on Albert Street always looks guilty." "No, Hester, this is symbolic," Miss Vole insisted. "A cradle, and now the register of births. Someone is trying to unwrite a child." Mrs. Winstable's spoon froze in her sugar bowl. "Unwrite?" Miss Vole nodded solemnly. erased, as if never born. You mark my words, something unholy happened in that church years ago. By tea time, the town was united in one of its periodic moral frenzies. Curtains twitched, consciences stiffened, and in at least 3 households dinner was served late because of speculation. At the vicarage, Mrs. Harcourt sat rigid in her armchair, twisting a lace handkerchief. "I don't see how I can explain it," she murmured to her husband. "The key was in my sewing box, I'm certain of it." "Perhaps it fell out," said the vicar weakly. "I never drop things," she said, with the certainty of someone who frequently did. "Besides, if the police discover I had the key—" She broke off as a knock sounded. "Come in," said the vicar, his voice a resigned sigh. Inspector Pubright entered, hat in hand, his expression courteous and unreadable. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Harcourt. I wonder if I might ask a few questions." She attempted a smile. "Of course, Inspector. It's all so dreadful. I can't imagine who'd take a church book." "Imagination," said Pubright mildly, "is rarely in short supply around here." He glanced at her handkerchief, faintly perfumed. Lavender again. "Did you by chance see Mrs. Gallo yesterday evening?" he asked. Her eyes widened, just a fraction too much. "Why? No, certainly not. Why should I?" Pubright looked almost apologetic. "Because the vicar tells me she still has access to the vestry, and because she seems rather anxious to control what the church remembers." Mrs. Harcourt's composure faltered. I can't say anything, Inspector. It's not my secret to tell." Pubright nodded gravely. "Secrets have a way of outliving those who keep them, Mrs. Harcourt. If you want to prevent harm, truth is the kinder weapon." He turned to go. Behind him, her voice quavered. "Inspector, she only wanted to protect someone. Years ago. A child, perhaps. She said it was better that way." He paused at the door. Better for whom? But she said nothing more. That evening, long after dark, Mrs. Gallo appeared at the police station. She was heavily veiled, dressed in the same unrelenting grey, and carried an envelope. "I won't sit," she said curtly, placing it on Purbright's desk. "You may open it when I've gone." "As you wish," said Pubright, not moving. "You think you're clever," she continued, voice trembling. "You think you've found something shameful in an old woman's life, but shame is only what other people enjoy in you." Pubright inclined his head. "You mistake me, Mrs. Gallo. I have no interest in shame, only in accuracy." She hesitated, then turned to leave. "There are things," she said quietly, "that must remain buried. For mercy's sake, Inspector, let them." When she was gone, he opened the envelope. Inside lay a single photograph, faded, almost sepia, showing a young woman holding an infant wrapped in the same ivory satin now folded in his evidence drawer. Written on the back in elegant handwriting, E.D., April 1949. No surname, just the name and the same initials engraved on the cradle. Late that night, Pubright remained alone in his office. The rain had ceased. The streets outside glimmered like varnished pews under the lamps. He placed the photograph beside the torn ledger scrap and the silver rattle. The 3 relics seemed to regard one another, quietly testifying. A cradle stolen to erase its memory. A register vanished to remove a record, and a name, Edie, caught between ownership and omission. He wrote slowly in his notebook, "Someone tried to protect a life by pretending it never existed. Now someone else protects the pretense." He closed the book, extinguished the lamp, and stood by the window. In the town below, the church clock struck 11. Each chime sounded like a question being politely repeated. And Pubright, watching the fog roll up the street, knew that tomorrow's inquiries would no longer be about theft, but about forgiveness. Inspector Pubright had always believed that crime, in its modest Flaxborough form, was rarely about wickedness. It was more often about tidying up. People, he thought, committed misdemeanors not to hurt, but to edit. They deleted what embarrassed them, rearranged what could not be borne, and then lived as though the rearrangement had always been the truth. That Thursday evening, the inspector sat alone in his office, coat off, lamp dimmed to a low amber halo. Outside, the last of the market traders were packing away their stalls, their chatter faint through the drizzle. The town was closing itself neatly for the night. Before him lay three objects: the silver rattle, its surface dulled by time, the photograph marked Edie, and the torn note from Fentiman's babywear. They formed together the shape of a confession, though none of them could speak. He leaned back, listening to the clock's tick, steady, unsentimental. There was, he reflected, a certain pathos in how respectable people conducted their sins. They sinned with such good manners. Mrs. Gallo, for instance, had managed to bury 30 years of scandal beneath lace doilies and civic virtue, yet all it took to disturb the soil was one borrowed cradle and an exhibition committee eager to show it off. It was almost poetic, the past displayed as heritage, reclaiming its own meaning. He reached for his pipe, then decided against it. Instead, he opened his notebook and began to write. There are crimes that demand pursuit. Others merely request understanding. This is not a case of theft, but of memory misplaced. Perhaps deliberately so. A cradle, a record, a name. Together they describe what the town refused to, a mother who was not allowed to be one. He paused, the nib of his pen resting against the page. In Flaxborough, motherhood was a public office, to be fulfilled decorously, advertised, through prams and christenings, commemorated by framed school photographs. But a mother without a husband, or a husband without pride, did not qualify. The system of virtue depended on shared delusion. Truth was only respectable when it matched the minutes of the parish council. And so, thought Pubright, they had tidied Edie Gallo out of existence. He imagined her, a young woman in 1949, frightened, perhaps alone, perhaps not. A nurse paid to silence her. A cradle stored away as a relic rather than a memory. Then, decades later, the Women's Guild displaying that same cradle beneath church lights, congratulating themselves on its gleam. It was almost kind, the irony. Almost. The office door creaked softly. Constable Love's head appeared round the frame, hesitant as ever. "Sir, thought you might like some tea. Bit cold out." "Very good of you, Love." The young constable placed the mug on the desk, noticed the photograph and frowned. "That the missing baby, sir?" Pubright gave a faint smile. "I doubt she's missing, Love. Only forgotten." Love considered this. "Funny, that. My mum keeps everything. School drawings, report cards. Says memories are what you leave behind when you've gone." "Wise woman," said Pubright. Though in Flaxborough, people prefer to leave nothing behind, just the correct impression. Love nodded, uncertain whether philosophy required a salute. He left quietly. Pubright returned his gaze to the photograph. The woman's face, young, proud, and a little sad, looked straight into the camera, unashamed. The infant in her arms was swaddled in that same satin cloth, now yellowed with time. He thought again of Mrs. Gallo's plea. There are things that must remain buried, but burial, he reflected, was never the same as rest. The dead did not mind. It was the living who haunted themselves. He turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Every small town cultivates amnesia as a crop. It grows well in tidy soil, yet memory, like dandelion roots, persists beneath the paving stones." He smiled faintly at his own metaphor. Literary indulgence was his one private sin, and closed the notebook. Outside, a clock chimed 9. The drizzle had thickened to proper rain, pattering gently on the station roof. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once, then stopped. Pubright stood, stretched, and looked out of the window at the quiet town square. The lamps gleamed on the cobblestones, the shop fronts shuttered and obedient. A fine place, Flaxborough. Not for truth, but for peace. He murmured softly to himself, "They call it respectability. I call it camouflage." As he prepared to leave, his glance fell once more on the silver rattle. It caught a glimmer of light, the engraved initials almost winking at him. He placed it carefully back in its box beside the photograph and locked the drawer. There was no need to chase the missing register tonight. Whoever had taken it would return it. Thieves, driven by guilt, always did. The real work lay not in recovery, but in recognition. And in the morning, he decided, he would make one more polite visit. To Mrs. Gallo. Not to accuse, not even to question, just to understand. For understanding, he thought, was the most persuasive form of interrogation. He turned off the lamp. The room fell into shadow, save for the faint glint of rain against the glass. In that dimness, Pubright could almost hear the faintest echo of an infant's cry. Not literal, of course, merely memory, whispering in an old building that had learned too many silences. He closed the door softly behind him, as one might leave a nursery. Saturday dawned still and pale, the kind of morning when the mist lingers over Flaxborough's rooftops like indecision. The church bells tolled practice notes for Sunday, and the market square, half empty, seemed to hold its breath. At the police station, Pubright arrived earlier than usual. Constable Love found him at his desk, straightening his notes, as if arranging exhibits for a museum few would ever visit. "Sleep well, sir?" "Like a conscience," said Pubright, restless but untroubled. He glanced up. "Is Mrs. Harcourt still at the vicarage?" "Yes, sir." "Then we'll start there. Bring the car. Quietly, please. I wouldn't want to startle salvation." The vicarage sitting room smelled of damp hymnals and tea already poured. The Reverend Harcourt, pale and flustered, stood by the fireplace, attempting to look uninvolved. Mrs. Harcourt, on the other hand, sat rigidly on the sofa, hands clasped in penitential readiness. Pubright inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Harcourt, I've come to return something." He placed on the table a brown paper parcel tied with string. "The baptismal register. It was found behind the church organ this morning." The vicar looked startled. "Good heavens, how did it—" "It didn't," said Pubright. "It was placed there by someone who feared it might be missed if it vanished altogether." He untied the string, opened the book to a certain blank page, and smoothed it flat. Between March and April 1949, an entry once existed here, ink faintly impressed on the next leaf. Mrs. Harcourt's breath quickened. Pubright continued, "The name was erased long ago, not by you, I think, but by your predecessor. The pressure, however, remains. It spells Edie." The vicar made a small, helpless sound. "Oh dear." Pubright turned to Mrs. Harcourt. "You assisted Mrs. Gallo in this matter. She told me so." Mrs. Harcourt lowered her head. "I did, Inspector. She begged me. Said her husband would lose everything if the truth came out. I thought I was being merciful." "Mercy," said Pubright, "has the peculiar habit of needing repetition." He closed the register and replaced it in the parcel. "The record is restored, but unofficially. You needn't fear scandal." She looked up through her tears. "Why are you being kind?" Purbright's smile was faint, almost weary. "Because it costs less than blame and lasts longer." As Pubright left the vicarage, Constable Love handed him a note. "Telephone message from Mrs. Winstable, sir. She says she's found something curious behind her tool shed." "Mrs. Winstable's definition of curious encompasses most of creation," said Pubright, getting into the car. "Still, best humour her." They drove across town to the Winstable residence, where the lady herself awaited in full moral plumage. "It's most extraordinary, Inspector. My gardener discovered a bit of silver sticking out from the soil. I told him at once it might be evidence. He wanted to polish it. Typical man." She led them into the garden. Beneath the hydrangeas lay a patch of disturbed earth. Pubright knelt, brushed aside damp soil, and exposed the curve of something ornate. He lifted it gently. The silver cradle. Mud-streaked, tarnished, but unmistakable. "Well," said Pubright softly, "Flaxborough's first case of resurrection." Mrs. Winstable beamed. "I knew it would be me who found it. I always say the Lord rewards diligence." "Then please accept my congratulations, madam," said Pubright. "You have successfully solved, or at least unearthed, the mystery." He signalled for Love to take the relic to the car. As they drove away, Love asked, "Do we charge Mrs. Gallo, sir?" Pubright shook his head. "For what, Love? Theft of her own shame? No, we'll let the earth keep her secret a little longer." Back at the station, Pubright placed the cradle on his desk. It looked oddly defiant, gleaming faintly under the lamplight. He studied it, as one might a retired witness, no longer dangerous, but still capable of discomfort. He dictated quietly for his report. Subject: missing silver cradle. Recovered. Cause: emotional distress. No intent to permanently deprive. Resolution: object restored to custody. No further action. He paused, then added in the margin, human frailty, sufficient sentence in itself. That evening he walked once more to St. Margaret's Road. He found Mrs. Gallo in her garden, pruning lilac with precise ritual motions. She turned as he approached, weary but unsurprised. "So they found it?" she said. "Yes, Mrs. Winstable's gardener will doubtless receive a commendation for agricultural vigilance." A faint smile. "You'll return it to me?" "It belongs to the church display committee, technically," said Pubright. "But I've suggested it remain in private care. They were only too pleased to oblige." She nodded slowly. "And the register?" "Restored, quietly. Without names, but not quite blank anymore. History prefers its ghosts labelled." She put down her shears, hands trembling slightly. "Then it's finished." Pubright looked at her for a moment. "Do you really think it ever is?" Her lips parted to reply, then closed again. He glanced toward the lilac bush, faint new shoots glistening from the rain. "It's curious," he said softly. "For years people thought the gallows gave Flaxborough its clock tower as a monument to civic pride. I rather think it was guilt, counting time as atonement." She smiled faintly. "You see too much, Inspector." "It's my job," he said, "but I promise not to repeat what I see." Later, alone in his office, Pubright locked the recovered cradle in the evidence cupboard. Its curved handle caught the lamplight one last time before darkness closed around it. He poured himself tea from a chipped pot and wrote the final entry in his notebook. Case concluded, without arrest, without satisfaction, yet somehow just. Truth is rarely comfortable company. One must seat it politely and let it leave when it's ready. He smiled to himself. Outside, the church bell marked 8. The town was already returning to its comforting routines. Gossip cooling, morality reasserting itself, conscience tucking itself in for the night. And yet, somewhere beneath a lilac bush, the rain would still be washing silver clean. Sunday came mild and still. Flaxborough's market square shone faintly under a sky the colour of pewter. The church bells rang their ordinary service, untroubled by secrets. The world, or at least the portion of it called Flaxborough, had decided that nothing terrible had really happened after all. The Silver Cradle mystery, as the Flaxborough Gazette named it, was already softening into anecdote. The front page devoted 3 inches to its conclusion. Missing cradle found in garden, police praise. Local vigilance, no further action expected. The article contained no mention of Mrs. Gallo, of course. Instead, it featured a photograph of Mrs. Winstable smiling modestly beside the restored relic, now safely held for cleaning. The town nodded in collective satisfaction. The matter was resolved decently without unpleasantness. At St. Saviour's, the Reverend Harcourt chose forgiveness and forgetfulness as his Sunday theme. His congregation listened with that blend of solemnity and self-congratulation peculiar to the English conscience. "In forgiving others," he intoned, "we lighten our own hearts, but in forgetting wrongs, we lighten theirs." It was, by general agreement, one of his better sermons. Mrs. Harcourt dabbed her eyes discreetly. Mrs. Gallo remained very still. Only Inspector Pubright, seated discreetly near the back, looked faintly amused. He had always felt that in Flaxborough forgetting was less a virtue than a pastime. When the congregation dispersed into the churchyard, gossip resumed like birdsong after rain. "Such a relief," said Mrs. Peebles, adjusting her hat. "All that fuss over nothing." "Well, dear," said Mrs. Winstable, "you know how people are, always inventing drama. I never believed in that nonsense about illegitimate children." "Of course not," said Miss Vole, her expression virtuous and pale. "We are not that kind of town." No one noticed Mrs. Gallo slip quietly through the side gate, her veil drawn. She walked alone along the river path, the sound of bells following faintly behind. At the bend, she paused, looking down at the slow brown water. For the first time in years, her face looked unguarded, not happy, not sad, but something gentler, finished. She dropped a small white flower into the current and watched it drift away. By Monday, even the police had lost interest. Constable Love spent the morning rearranging old files and whistling tunelessly. The sound was so earnest that Pubright did not have the heart to stop him. "Busy day, love?" "Not yet, sir, but I expect Mrs. Winstable will find something else to report soon. She's like the weather, reliable." "Indeed," said Pubright. "Perhaps she'll discover the mystery of the missing postbox paint. That one has eluded Scotland Yard." Love grinned, then hesitated. "Sir? Do you ever wish for a proper case? Something big?" Pubright regarded him with gentle amusement. "My dear love, I live in a town where the greatest passion is for jam competitions and chairmanships. If evil exists here, it's in committee minutes." He stood, gathering a few papers. "But I'll tell you something. The smallest crimes leave the longest shadows. They stretch right into people's dreams." Love nodded vaguely, uncertain whether that required an arrest. In his office, Pubright typed his final entry for the week. His report was brief, factual, and unrevealing, a bureaucratic lullaby. Case reference, 1284, theft, recovered. Subject, Silver Cradle, circa 1880, complainant. Women's Guild, St. Saviour's Church. Recovered, private garden, St. Margaret's Road. Action, no prosecution. Matter concluded. He paused, then, as was his quiet habit, added one unofficial line by hand at the bottom of the page. Truth retrieved, gently returned to silence. He slipped the paper into its file, closed the folder, and placed it in the cabinet marked Miscellaneous. The drawer clicked shut like a punctuation mark. That night, the town seemed especially still. The river shimmered faintly under the street lamps, and the church clock ticked away its mechanical forgiveness. Pubright sat by his window, coat on, cup of tea cooling beside him. He could hear, faintly, the laughter from a distant pub and the rhythmic hum of a late train sliding past the station. He thought of Mrs. Gallow's garden, the rain-softened earth, the cradle resting beneath its lilac canopy. Perhaps, he mused, it was fitting. A cradle returned to the ground, like a promise kept belatedly. He imagined Flaxborough as it would be tomorrow, Mrs. Winstable arguing with a butcher about scales, Miss Vole attending to her cat, Mrs. Harcourt practicing compassion in moderation. Life neat again. He smiled to himself, not with satisfaction, but with a sort of weary fondness. The town would forget as it always did, but memory, he knew, would remain in the soil and in one inspector's private drawer. He reached for his notebook and wrote the final line. Peace restored, hypocrisy undisturbed, humanity intact. Then he closed it, turned off the light, and let the darkness settle around him like an old coat. Outside, the clock tower built by Alderman Gallow struck midnight. 12 polite, civic chimes. In Mrs. Gallow's garden, the lilac trembled faintly in the night breeze, its roots brushing against something silver deep below. And Flaxborough, having once more rearranged its truths into something comfortable, slept peacefully under the illusion of virtue.